How many times have you stepped on the scale, cringed at the number, and thought, this isn't working? Like, how did I gain 2 pounds overnight when I have been living off of boiled chicken and veggies? So you either give up completely or start from scratch with a plan that's even harder. But what if I told you the problem isn't your plan? That it's a lack of patience combined with how you're measuring results that's keeping you stuck? I get it, because I used to do the same thing. But after 30 years of suffering through every diet under the sun, I finally figured out what works. Not only have I lost 50 pounds and kept it off, but I've also helped other women do the same thing with a simple strategy that finally gets their scale to budge. But if you keep relying on that hunk of junk next to your toilet to determine your progress, then your results will stink worse than the bathroom after your husband just spent 20 minutes scrolling shorts. So in this video, I'll show you what's really happening when you lose fat the right way, why it's practically the scale's job to lie to you, and what you need to focus on instead for a plan that works. But why should you quit relying on the scale when it's been the #1 way to track weight loss since the dawn of time? Or at least since the 1950s, when women became obsessed with their weight, so they relied on a steady diet of cigarettes, wine, and boiled eggs to make their new bathroom bestie go down. But fat loss is just like this ice cube I left melting on the counter. Since I live in Arizona, you'd expect this ice cube to melt quickly. But in reality, you'd have to watch for at least 30 to 60 minutes before it turns into a puddle of water. Fat loss works the exact same way. Just because you changed all of your habits overnight, that doesn't mean your fat automatically melts away. Even though you want fast results, just like a melting ice cube, your body takes time to respond. But keep in mind, this ice cube is at least 75,000 times smaller than you. So even though this may only take an hour to melt, if we had an ice cube that weighed 150 pounds or more, it would take way longer to notice any changes at all. Just like a big ice block, your body doesn't change all at once, which sucks because we all want a big splash. But the truth is, real fat loss is more like a slow drip that will eventually fill the whole glass, but only if you're patient. At first, the outer layer melts, and all you may notice are small puddles. If you want the core to melt, you have to be patient since this part takes time. But just because you don't see instant changes, that doesn't mean that nothing's happening. At this point, you can either continue to let it slowly melt or put it back in the freezer and try again on Monday. But every time you put it back in the freezer, that stops the process, which is exactly what happens whenever you start a new fat loss plan. If you're losing fat the right way, you won't notice much at first. But small things like having more energy or your clothes fitting better are great signs that your plan is working. And even though your scale might not move, sometimes for up to the first 3 to 6 weeks, that doesn't mean that nothing's happening. This is where patience comes in. Because just like the core of a big ice block doesn't instantly melt, neither does your fat. But most people quit before any significant melting begins, which usually comes down to putting all of your trust in your bathroom bestie without realizing that's the worst way to measure progress. So as long as you're following a high protein diet, eating in a moderate calorie deficit, and strength training at least 2 to 3 days each week, give your plan a minimum of 90 days to work. If the scale keeps telling you to quit, get rid of it. Since you finally understand that extreme diets only lead to rapid weight regain, and you have to be done with all of those quick fixes if you want your results to stick. Because happiness will never come from eating boiled eggs for every meal, no matter how fast your scale drops in the beginning. Remember, health and fitness are a lifelong journey, so there's no need to rush. You just have to quit putting your ice cube back in the freezer and keep going. But you may be wondering, how am I supposed to know if I'm actually getting results or just wasting the next 90 days with a plan that's going nowhere? Well, now with the scale, I can tell you that much. Let's go back to our ice cube to explain why it's pretty much the scale's full-time job to lie to you. If you stare at an ice cube for 20 minutes, it looks exactly the same, which may leave you wondering, is this thing even melting? But when you give it just a little more time, suddenly there's a puddle, which is how fat loss works. It's happening slowly behind the scenes with no regard to the number that pops up on your scale. But if you're impatient, thinking nothing's happening if that thing's not dropping at least 2 pounds every week, your fat will never melt or get breathed out. Because, fun fact, you don't actually burn fat, since 84% of the fat you lose is breathed out as carbon dioxide. The other 16% exits through water loss like sweat, urine, and tears. So if you ever do find yourself crying over this scale, just know that you're technically burning fat while doing it. And sometimes all you need is a really hard, ugly cry to get your head back in the game. But also keep in mind, the scale is the absolute worst way to measure progress. Mostly because it never shows what's really happening inside your body. Things like water retention, digestion, and even muscle growth all affect the number you see when you step on the scale. So while I personally step on the scale every day to get a weekly weight average, I never give the number that pops up a second thought. I only use it as data to get my weekly weight trend. Then I use that alongside other metrics like body fat percent, progress photos, how my clothes fit, and how heavy I'm lifting to give me the full picture of what actually is going on. But the number on the scale is the metric I put the least amount of focus on. Because if I step on the scale and my weight is up, but my body fat percent is down, that's cause for celebration because I just got leaner. Even with that stupid scale laughing in my face. But I got the last laugh, you stupid scale. But I'm not saying the scale going up should inspire some kind of flash mob with women proudly waving scales above their heads. Because the only way to celebrate an achievement like this is if you know that you've been putting in the work. And no, just showing up to the gym doesn't count. You still need to be consistent with all of the other habits that help you build muscle so you burn more fat or breathe it out, like eating more protein, getting high quality sleep, and following a progressive overload lifting plan, which sounds like a lot of work. But we're not looking for perfection. You just have to be good enough. Let's go back to that ice cube to explain the difference between good enough to get results versus complete and utter failure because you obsessed over being perfect. If you leave an ice cube out consistently, it will always melt. But if you keep tossing it back in the freezer, it never fully disappears, which is what happens when you constantly stop and restart diets over and over. But the reason most women feel the need to stop their diet in the first place is it is way too hard. You think because I told you to lift heavier weights, that means you need to hit the gym 6 days a week. And because you heard me say eating in a calorie deficit is what works, that you better slash your calories to 1,200 a day. And since you heard some other guy say to stop eating so much fat while another swears that carbs are the devil himself, well, now you're down to a steady diet of boiled chicken and sadness. But if that's what you heard me say when I talk about eating more protein in a moderate deficit while lifting heavy 2 to 3 days each week, you clearly heard me wrong. Because you don't need a perfect fat loss plan to get results. You just need a consistent one, especially since perfection will only leave you to crash and burn before the weekend even begins. But the more consistent you are with the basics that are good enough, like strength training, high protein meals, and patience, the faster you'll actually see results. But most women find the basics too boring to stick to, so you quit right before breaking through. Frustrated with slow results, you put the ice back in the freezer when all you had to do was keep waiting. So if you want real results, stop falling for every quick fix you come across that always leaves you starting from scratch. As long as you're consistent with habits that are good enough, that's how you'll finally achieve your goals. But if you keep falling for this next diet trap, you'll never get there. Imagine pulling that ice cube out every day, waiting 20 minutes for it to melt, but throwing it back in the freezer when nothing happens. Do you think your ice cube will ever change if you restart the process every time you're impatient and give up? Maybe last week you tried rubbing it with your hand to make it melt faster, but nothing, so back into the freezer it went. And this week you thought placing it in the sun has to work, but the small puddle that resulted just wasn't fast enough. So you put it back in the freezer and vow to try again on Monday, but only after you spend the entire weekend researching how to make it melt even faster. The same thing happens to you whenever you quit and restart a new diet every time life isn't perfect. This type of dieter, also known as the I'll just start Monday dieter, never gets results because she's always in a big hurry. But the people who succeed don't keep rushing and resetting the process. They just keep going. Every time life happens, they let it happen without judgment, and then they get right back on track with their very next choice. Quitting the "I'll just start again Monday" mindset is the exact shift you need to finally achieve your goals. Because if you continually destroy all of the hard work you put in during the week, only to binge all weekend while vowing to start again Monday, that's like watching this big ice block melt for a few days and then sticking it back in the freezer, wondering why you never get results. But since you can easily undo all of the work you did during the week with just one solid cheat day, you're not just putting that ice block back into the freezer. You're adding the water that melted back before freezing, leading you to start from scratch each and every week. Then you find yourself wondering why nothing's happening, even though you've been on a diet for months. But when you stop allowing yourself to start fresh every time life happens, and you just make the next right decision instead, that's when your consistency turns into real results. If you're ready to stop freezing your process and actually let the ice melt, commit to 90 days of showing up with no quitting and no second guessing. Of course, if you want results, you have to go into those 90 days with a solid plan. Watch this video next to learn the exact system I use to lose 50 pounds, which is the same system I still follow to easily keep it off.